Well, the question now, of course, is this a negotiation, but does the White House actually risk pushing it too far? I want to go to former U.S. Treasury Chief Representative in Beijing, Michael Hirson. Michael, I think one of the anxieties for people who are backing President Trump's efforts here and think that perhaps tariffs were the only arrow in our quiver since everything else had been tried to no avail is, when do we accept victory? What does victory look like? Because ultimately we know China's Xi has to somehow save face as well.
I think that's right. And that's really the part of this that President Trump hasn't spelled out yet. In other words, he's applied the pressure, but the U.S. side has not been very clear about its ultimate demands here. We've got a lot of different asks for the Chinese, and I think now, before escalating further, would be a good time to clarify what we want and to try to land at a realistic place with Beijing.
In your opinion, what would that realistic place look like?
Well, I think we've got to address the two core issues that President Trump has focused on, obviously. One is the trade deficit, and I think that's actually the easiest area to make progress. And really, the goal here should be not specific commitments from China to buy X amount of U.S. exports, but really some structural measures, lowering tariffs, cutting out some of the non-tariff barriers that China uses to restrict U.S. exports. I think that's fairly achievable. The really difficult conversation is over technology and what you could call China's industrial policies. And that is tough because the innovation rivalry between the U.S. and China is becoming more intense, and it's really becoming infused with national security issues. So that's going to be tough. And I think what we need to do there is really lay out some clear principles of what we want to see from China in terms of how it funds its tech industry and its other innovative sectors. But we need to be clear and not just give an impression that we're trying to contain China's rise as a technology power, because frankly, I don't think that's realistic. And in Beijing, that kind of talk is leading the Chinese officials to say, look, Trump isn't really looking for a deal. He's just really looking to derail China. I don't think that's productive over the long term.
Yeah, and of course, you get back to the Boxer Revolution and the Opium Wars and China's history with the West, and it certainly plays up pretty well for an economy, by the way, a Chinese economy that apparently is starting to feel the pain. We learned overnight that the export orders at 48.4 in contraction, 4 months in a row of sinking numbers there to Shanghai. Now the Shanghai down 2% today, down 15% for the year, down 63% from June 1st. There are some serious issues there. So there's got to be some sort of urge or need, even within China, to sort of find a way to fix this. On the technology side, the idea that America won't derail Made in China 2025, but certainly it should no longer be done on the back of American ingenuity. They should not be allowed to openly steal American secrets and Western company secrets with these joint ventures with a force of 51% ownership. That has to be on the table.
That's absolutely right. I mean, this is the right fight to pick. I think most people, even in the trade community, folks who don't generally approve of tariffs would say, okay, if we have to pick a fight, this is the right one to pick. But we have to do it in a way that sets out an approach that's realistic for China to follow. And I think a lot of that involves being clear in terms of what principles we need China to follow, and also, really importantly, working with allies. That is a really critical missing piece here. President Trump, by threatening tariffs against the EU, against Japan, against Canada, he is making it more difficult for allies, many of whom have these same concerns, to work with us productively. So that's really a critical piece here.
Although maybe that'll be a moot point after what we've heard with the EU. We'll see. I mean, honestly, to be quite frank with you, Michael, I don't like the idea of going into battle with France. I mean, I don't think they have the willpower, the guts, or the economy to stand toe-to-toe with America and push back against China, particularly as China is pouring money into Europe and some of these other nations through this, belt, through this new Silk Road initiative. And I look at Iran. They don't even want to bring Iran. They don't want to scotch the Iranian nuclear because of economic issues. So I'm leery about that, although I hear most experts say that that would be an easier way to do it. So where do you see us going from here? Because, again, as this data starts to filter in, this morning in America, we got the manufacturing PMI number. You had two things that manufacturers are concerned about: the labor issue, which is a crisis, and more of them are talking about the tariff issue as well.
Well, look, I mean, clearly the tariffs are going to have an impact. The issue right now is that they probably will have an impact with some lag, and the U.S. economy is very strong right now. So businesses are going to start to feel the pain. As we get to this next round of $200 billion, consumers are going to start to feel the pain as well. Right now, President Trump seems to feel very confident about this strategy, doesn't seem worried about how this could impact U.S. midterm elections. So I think for the time being, that the signs would point to us going ahead with further escalation.
Right.
But I think it's closer to 2019 when the real economic impacts of this are felt, the market impacts, that we're more likely to see the White House say, okay, where do we go from here? What's the landing zone?
Yeah, you know, another take also is that maybe he thinks it might help with the midterms, because I think a lot of Trump voters think he's coming from the right place, and some are willing to endure some pain. You know, we'll see. A lot of this is brand new. We haven't been down this territory before. Thank you very much. Appreciate your expertise.
Thank you.